Okay, great. So, Manu, thank you so much for being here tonight and making the time. I'm super excited that everyone is going to get to talk to you because you're always such a wonderful raconteur, and have wonderful stories and a wonderful insights. So, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me, Lakshmi. This is the first time I'm doing an AMA on video. I've done it once on Reddit, which was a written thing. So this is a new experience for me as well. I hope it goes well.
Yes, yes. And our people are very, very nice and thoughtful and wonderful. So, no one's going to be trolling or being rude. Okay, let me kick off with the first question, which is actually a tricky question. But it's something that occurred to me while I was reading your books. And I think one of the things I love so much about your writing is the stories and actually history as storytelling, which is not something I ever experienced when I was young, my generation. The way we were taught history or we read history, especially Indian history, was very dry, it was very dull. I've read fantastic things in Western history that were like wonderful stories, etc. And I really am so impressed with your ability to bring things to life, right? But on the other hand, I also love historical fiction, which is, it takes history and turns it into fiction. And then certain liberties are taken, but you don't really know what liberties were taken where, right? And as you have the rising popularity of both, and then you have among certain quarters actually to reduce history to a story that you can change if it doesn't suit your purpose, that you can take out elements, you can introduce new elements. Where do you think history as storytelling? I just wanted, if that is in your mind, if that's something you think about, yeah, that's it. It just occurs to me, and I was sort of vaguely worried about it.
I think it's important to make history accessible without compromising on the integrity of your research and the diversity of your sources and how solid your work, your groundwork really is. So at least in my case, the effort is that the research is as solid as I can make it, but it's the output as you present it to the world where you use a little bit of writing skill as well, where it isn't just a dry chronological sequence of events that you're describing, but you put something of an effort to invite the reader in, to make it interesting for the reader and to really woo the reader into the story itself. But you're right, there is also in a format where increasingly storytelling and history as storytelling is becoming popular. Sometimes perhaps with books, I don't know whether we can say it with great confidence, but for example, on social media, videos, etc., there's always a risk that because of the medium, because there's a time limit, say you have a 15-minute video, even in conversations like this, if I had to sort of encapsulate a complex idea in a 10-minute answer, instinctively you end up simplifying things, which sometimes runs the risk of becoming too simplistic, which is a risk, it's definitely true. But I think with books, at least the popular history writers that I like reading, there is an effort to be very strong on research and not compromise there, and to make sure yet that the prose is very readable and engaging. And I think in a time where history is increasingly political and people talk about it being twisted and so on, those of us who do study history, I think, also have a responsibility to try and make it more accessible. There's also a lot of good that's being done because you're actually increasing the readership for history in general. What otherwise would be constrained to seminar circuits and a scholarly crowd is now accessible to larger audiences. It also means that more questions may be asked. Some of it may not be questions we like. Some of it may be people, misreading things even. But I think on the whole, it's a good trend. On the whole, it's a healthy trend. And we're in some ways catching up quite late because in Western countries, and this is a point I often make, scholars have never had hesitation writing for popular audiences, whether it's Indian scholars even. A prime example is Supriya Gandhi, who wrote a wonderful book on Dara Shikoh. She's an authority on the subject. The research is great. She's read the Persian language originals herself. And the book at the same time is highly readable, and it's written for a general audience as well. It's not written only for scholars. Mary Beard, who is a British historian, SPQR, her famous book, it's written for a popular audience, but she's also a scholar with very serious credentials. So I think that trend is growing in India as well, and it's something I welcome.
But what do you think about the idea of, like, I know maybe you don't want to really get into it, and that's okay. Is this idea that history is infinitely malleable because it has so many different elements, right? You can somehow, so for example, with science at some level or math, you can't really make two and two and add up to four, right?
Yeah.
But because history is messy and it's complicated, because nothing really fits an easy single narrative, it's much easier to sort of edit um, a different story out of the same material.
Yeah. It's true, because the thing is, ultimately, it's about connecting dots. It's about reading the evidence and often about interpreting the evidence. In my case, for example, I work on the modern period where we have a huge number of sources because it's relatively recent. It's the last 3.5 centuries. So, the kind of material you have is richer. But often, the further you go back in time, say to the Mughal era, the early modern period, the late medieval period, the ancient period, the material you're playing with is more and more slender, which means there's greater interpretation, there's greater sort of critical engagement with the text, which means that one scholar may connect those dots one way, the other may connect it another way, which means there are going to be conflicting interpretations and ideas about what happened. So that's definitely a part of history, though. I mean, one can't really call that a problem, because history is about constantly revising what we know about the past. It is about constantly looking at the same material with new perspectives. It is about old conclusions getting revised with the addition of new evidence, new data, new raw material. For example, somebody writing on Shivaji in 1920 would not have the same perspective as somebody writing in 2020, because a lot of our scholarly perspectives have changed. A lot of information and knowledge we have has changed. A lot of other things have also changed. So, people writing about women in history in the 19th century often reduce them either to these sinister plotting figures who didn't really have a role in history. But today, thanks to feminist perspectives, we know that actually that's not how you look at women figures. And you look at institutions like the harem, you look at political women as political actors in their own right, not as aberrations, not as people who are not meant to be there, but who actually did have political authority and political personality. So the perspective has changed, and therefore our conclusions have changed. In my third book, The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, the courtesan, why is the courtesan important? For the longest time, courtesans were written off in the Victorian period onwards as just dancing girls who were, the wrong kind of women, not respectable women. But in reality, think of them as women with sexual agency, with education, with financial autonomy, with independence. They didn't have a Mangal Sutra around their necks tying them to marriage. And often these were mobile, interesting women who did interesting things, ranging from patronizing temples and patronizing the arts to setting up modern companies to recording on the gramophone. They were contributors to Indian history. So in that sense, revision is always a good thing. And revision also makes things clearer for historians themselves. You often find scholars who, in let's say when they were 30 years old, they would have believed in certain things. But as they approach 60, they may revise their own conclusions, which is not to say that their earlier conclusions were wrong. It's just that as time passes, new things take place, new ideas come into play. Naturally, your own conclusions may also change. And I have no issues, openly saying that perhaps 10, 20 years down the line, someone may try and revise some of the conclusions I've reached in some of my books. And that's not personal. It's not something that's some kind of an attack on you, unless, of course, it's done in a shoddy way and it's meant to be an attack. Those things are very obvious. But if it's a serious kind of engagement with your work and then a revision of that work, that has to be welcomed, because it takes the subject forward.
Great. Yeah. And actually, I think that's a great point. That is that if we did not revisit history,
yeah,
people who didn't belong to the right caste or the right gender or the right sexuality would just continue to be written out of history, right?
Just hold on for a second. I've suddenly got the bell ringing. 1 second.
Yes. This is perfectly a Splainer AMA, people. Last time we had Aditi Mittal, and I think her video was turned the wrong way around. So she did the entire, she did at least parts of it with her head crooked around. It is really funny. But it's part of how we do it. It's informal. Good. Was it someone important?
It was my grandmother. The thing is, I'm sitting in my work apartment, and she's, she was outside, and she wanted to ask me something. She'd forgotten that I was doing this, but yeah.
That's okay. That's
and it was very cute. She wanted to tell me something which was quite cute. Anyway.
All right. So I'm going to go to Ramya. Ramya, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Manu.
Hi.
I'm a huge fan. I've read The Ivory Throne. It took a while because it was so huge, but I really enjoyed reading it. So the question that I had was, like, there are so many history books, like there are so many sources on history and a lot of history books. So how do you know that, like, when you decide to start writing, how do you know that it's not already covered in some book that you've not read, maybe? Or, like, also because this is about Kerala, so what if there are some, I mean, there are many Malayalam, like, historians from Kerala also, right? So
yeah,
what if they have written about something like this? So how do you really know before you start writing that this is not already done in some part, in some other book or something?
So the thing is, since you mentioned The Ivory Throne, that book was written, it took 6 years to write that book. And in the process of those 6 years, you end up covering a lot of ground. You end up reading academic material, connected themes. You end up reading colonial era histories. You end up reading translations of various works. You end up dealing with the primary material, the letters, the files, the documents. You end up visiting places where these historical figures lived. And in that process, you identify the gaps that exist in the narrative. And that's how, you figure out that, okay, nobody seems to have done anything serious on this. In the case of The Ivory Throne, Sethu Lakshmi Bai of Travancore is the protagonist of that book. And I found that in all the existing material, she was either some kind of a footnote or just a paragraph, just people, flipped the page on. It wasn't a very serious engagement with her work and her as a person. And the only collection that existed on her was a collection her granddaughter brought out, which was essentially a publication of all her letters, etc. It's not an easily available book. It was privately published in the 1990s. And it's a great resource because it has all her correspondence published. But other than that, there was a huge gap. And because I spent the requisite time on it, it was clear that there was a gap to be filled there. But the more you read, the more widely you engage with any given topic, you're trained in a sense to understand the loopholes and find the gaps that exist in the narrative. And if it sort of whets your appetite, you end up going into those gaps and trying to fill that through your writing. So that's usually how it takes place. But often it can also be, this isn't the case of The Ivory Throne where there was a huge gap, but often it will also be that you want to contribute something for a different reason. So Rebel Sultans, for example, I don't work on that early modern period. I generally work on the modern period. But I was quite stunned, really, that there was a lot of scholarly work on Deccan history, or rather different facets of Deccan history. So Helen Fillon's done architecture, Pushkar Sahoni's done the Ahmednagar Sultanate, Richard Eaton's done some work, especially on the Sufis of the Deccan. But there was nothing that existed for a general audience to condense Deccan history. And it had been footnoted, as it were, between Mughal history and the Marathas. And I thought, I'm not going to add anything original here. I'm going to build on the work that others have already done. But I'm going to fill this gap here because in popular imagination, there isn't a good book on Deccan history, and I'd like to put something out there. So there, I wasn't really bringing great fresh research to the fore because other people have worked on that research. All I was doing was synthesizing that research, bringing it together, and producing a short volume. So as an introductory read to the Deccan for people who might be interested. So, you work on different books, different topics for different purposes sometimes. And, otherwise, of course, when you're more seriously sort of engaged in primary research and your own very in-depth, years and years and years of doing one project, then you identify the gaps and you try and fill those.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. What role does language play, I wonder, in terms of if you don't speak the language or you don't read the language, so does that influence your choice that I'm not going to go and do something in this part of the country because I really have no language skills there?
Yeah, I think it influences me only in one respect, which is Tamil, because some people keep saying, why don't you do something on the history of Tamil Nadu, which I will not do for the simple reason that it's such an ancient culture. There's such riches in terms of literature, the kind of material that's there, that unless you really have a very sound knowledge of Tamil as a language, I don't think you can venture into writing anything that can be called a credible history of that region. But that said and done, anybody working on Indian history faces a certain conundrum here because of languages, which is that in my case, I speak Malayalam with a degree of fluency because I'm a Malayali. I grew up in Maharashtra, so I can read and write and speak Marathi. Hindi, of course, I have a functional knowledge of Hindi. I can read and write Hindi as well. It may take me, I recently read a 100-page book on this one 19th century grandee's trip to Europe. It was a Hindi book. It took me a while, but I was able to decipher the whole thing and sort of translate it into English myself, so I could cite it in something I'm doing. So those languages I can handle, but India has dozens of languages, which means for somebody trying to work even on, say, Deccan history, where you've got Kannada, Telugu, Marathi, a smattering of Sanskrit, all of these languages, ultimately at some point or the other, you're going to end up having to rely on translations. And the way, I mean, the best thing to do there is to find the most recent translation by somebody who's established in the field and make use of that. So with Rebel Sultans, when I wanted the Raya Vachakamu, there was a wonderful translation that had come out. Similarly, for other texts also, there are translations. James Lane, controversial historian, but he's done a translation, a very good translation, with an Indian colleague of the Shiva Bharata, which was the Sanskrit poem composed in Chhatrapati Shivaji's time. So you use translations there, but I think it's useful to have knowledge of Indian languages. It is, in fact, I would say, critical to have knowledge of Indian languages. Even when I was doing the Ivory Throne, because I was fluent in Malayalam, even though sometimes I couldn't read the material, I could get a family member, my mother or grandmother, to read it out to me, record it, and I could do my own translations because I understood what it meant. But I've noticed other writers, I won't take names, who've written books on connected themes related to Kerala, making huge blunders. To the extent of sometimes female characters actually ended up as a male character, which I found really funny, simply because the terms were not familiar to them. And that is a risk when you're doing Indian history. But all the same, at some level, we do end up having to refer to translation simply because there are far too many languages for any single scholar to master.
Sure. So Dravida has a question about what you include and don't include. Dravida?
Hi, Manu.
Hi.
I'm a great fan of your books. I love all your stories and so on and so forth. It's a question on research. You mentioned about research. How do you decide which details you would include? Because Indian history is so huge, sometimes, it's very overwhelming to look at various sources and things like that. How do you decide which details are necessary and which details are not necessary in your book?
Well, sometimes some of these things are quite easy to decide. For example, when I was doing my book, The Ivory Throne, it was about the internal workings of a ruling family. It was about what was happening in the court within the corridors of power. And yet the archival material, some of it was explosive. It was about their private lives to the extent that it affected policy, to the extent that it affected politics. I included private material because you could trace a line and see that, okay, this is why this led to a certain political action. But where there was no politics involved, where it was just private material of what could be called a salacious character, I did not include it because that was not the point of including that kind of private information. It was not, the point was not to titillate the reader with private information of what people are doing in their bed chambers, unless, of course, it had a direct connection to how power operated and how certain decisions were reached at. So you had to sort of, it was a thin line, but I had to navigate that thin line, which is why, much later when I got a defamation notice for that book, I was quite amused because if I really wanted to defame anybody, there was a whole lot more I could have included in the book. So that's one category of things. The other is also sometimes you find a lot of, so when you're researching for a book, you find a lot of connected material. So if it's a book that's condensed in, say, 500 pages, I may actually have 5,000 or even more pages of notes simply based on all the material you've collected. Now, the thing is, you can't really end up including everything because then the narrative has no structure. Then your argument has no proper flow. Then it just sort of rambles about all over the place without actually making a point or making a point in too convoluted a manner. So there really you have to snip, and snipe and sort of cut down things and make sure that only essential things that are there make it to the narrative. I've found a shortcut around this, which is that I pack my book with dense notes. So even though the main text is readable, if you go to the final quarter of the book, usually 100, 150 pages of the published book, you'll find that every footnote, almost all my books, almost every footnote has almost, let's say, 4 or 5 lines to giving you further reading, giving you further information that did not make it to the main narrative, but I thought is important and therefore rests in the footnotes. So that's my way of including as much detail as possible without overwhelming the reader. So if a reader is interested in further information, they can look at the notes section of the book and find further information. But if you just like to stick to the main narrative, that's also possible. And I'm not overloading you with too much information, too much data. So, that's the other way by which I do it. But frankly, anything that is relevant to the argument, anything that's relevant to the topic gets included no matter what. It's not as if something essential gets cut out for any sinister reason or because it's inconvenient to the argument and so on. If something is frankly inconvenient to your argument, you end up having to revise your argument. You can't just ignore it and exclude it, because the frank truth is somebody else will find it and then call out your work and say that you didn't include this and that's not proper. So it's where it's necessary, you include everything, but where you think that certain things are superfluous, they're not necessary to the main narrative, there's no need to include that. I put it in the notes.
Thank you so much, Manu. Very, very insightful.
Thank you.
Shreya has a question about finding the stories untold that are typically untold. Shreya, or marginalized?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much. Hi, Manu. Thank you so much for doing this AMA. And as I mentioned in the question, I first heard you on Amit Verma's podcast, and I think it's one of my favorite episodes. And in there, you mentioned about the Queen of Travancore and also the Mapla Rebellion. Yeah. It kind of made me wonder, how do you find these stories that are not so mainstream and actually pick on researching more about them? Like, how do you get into these rabbit holes? And also, how would you suggest one getting into these not so mainstream stories, or any kind of different books or readings that you would suggest? Thank you.
I think some of it comes from personal taste and personal research interests, in the sense that all scholars have their own independent research interests. Somebody may be interested in the ancient world, somebody is interested in the medieval, somebody is interested in the history of textiles. So each person has a broad area which interests them, and that's why you can sort of give yourself the energy and appetite to actually go in and look for the material that you want to find. In my case, I'm always interested in things that are slightly forgotten or slightly marginalized or sidelined. And when I say sidelined or marginalized, we often think in India of marginalization, and I made this point the other day on a Clubhouse discussion as well, where marginalization is seen chiefly through the prism of class. So you have the upper class who are the mainstream, and the subaltern or the lower classes whose stories have not been told, which is true. That is one form of marginalization. But marginalization also operates in other ways. So with Setu Lakshmi Bai of Travancore in the first book, she was a queen. She was a woman of privilege. She lived in a palace. She had an allowance. She was rich. And yet she was marginalized on the basis of gender, which is also a legitimate kind of marginalization. I use legitimate in quotes. Similarly, the Deccan Sultans, they were sultans, they were people in power. And yet, in the way historiography has evolved, in the way history writing has taken place, and the narratives we've constructed in the country, the Mughals and the Marathas have dominated, and somehow this fascinating class of people who did some fairly interesting things for several centuries have been reduced to footnotes. So they had been marginalized in that way, and I wanted to try and resurrect that. With the third book also, all these little stories that are condensed as little essays in that book, in the course of my wider reading for other long-term projects, etc., I would come across these little nuggets of information. And it wasn't the kind of information you could really convert into a book, because there wasn't either that much material on the person, or the person wasn't important enough for that much resource material to exist on them. But yet these were interesting stories. And I decided that the courtesans of that book, the Italian Brahmin, for example, Roberto de Nobili, this fascinating white man who comes to India and then becomes a self-appointed Brahmin, people like that, I thought there's at least the least I could do is turn them into essays and put them into a volume of these sort of relatively unknown stories from Indian history. As I said, in general, the more widely you read on any given topic, you stumble into so many fascinating corners, so many fascinating subjects. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys that, then that evolves into something or the other in its own right. In my case, essays, in some cases books, but it's always something that's been neglected by the mainstream. Even my newest book, on the princely states, it comes from the time I was doing my first book, which was on Travancore. And I realized that this little part of southern Kerala that was the princely state, such complicated politics, caste politics, communalism, court intrigues, pressures from the British, how the Rajas presented themselves. So much was happening in just that one little princely enclave. clearly princely states were not just about rajas sitting on thrones and doing whatever they wanted and drinking champagne and watching dancing girls. There was more that was happening in the princely states. And then I realized that the princely states cover 40% of covered 40% of Indian territory. And yet most of our ideas of modern Indian history are about British ruled India, are about the 60%, which was directly under the British, where the nationalist movement emerged, which is important, but the other 40% is also important. If you are to obtain a fuller understanding of modern Indian history, it is important to also look at the other 40%. So the 40% that had been caricatured and stereotyped, I decided I'm going to take 5 of those princely states and try and look at them more seriously. And it was a productive venture, because I discovered that actually, no, they were not caricatures. There was a lot more that was happening in the princely states. In fact, a lot that can tell us about politics, caste, religion, how politics and people in power operate, all of that to this day. So, that is my general way of just looking for these stories. Other scholars will find things that are interesting to them in their chosen areas of research.
So I actually, something occurred to me while Anupama was asking her question, is that definitely it's fantastic that we're doing a lot more sort of unearthing of, the roles of women, the roles of communities that are marginalized and all of that. But I was thinking, what about the LGBTQ community? And especially since these are kind of modern categories, right? I mean, you can call people lesbian or gay or, queer or any of that. So what would that kind of history look like if we were going to sort of go back and say, because you may have someone very highly influential, but they didn't define themselves as a member or, either as lesbian or gay or bisexual or queer or whatever, right? So I wonder what a queer revisiting of Indian history would look like.
Actually, the one person I can think of who's done this before in the past also, when I've been asked this question, this is the name I give, which is Madhavi Menon, who teaches at Ashoka University. She's written this book, A Brief History of Desire in India. And it's an interesting book because familiar temple legends, familiar stories, she actually looks at them from a queer perspective, and you discover that, hold on, it's true. There is something queer going on here. There is something that is important and interesting here, which we haven't even noticed so far because we weren't looking for it, which was the case earlier with women as well. They were important. It's just that we weren't trained to look at them seriously. Therefore, we missed the story. And I think the same can be applied to what we would now define as LGBTQ plus subjects. You're right. In the past, people did not necessarily have these labels, which means that sometimes the boundaries are much more flexible. So there's something like pederasty in ancient Greece, if I'm not mistaken, which today would offend our sensibilities. Older men involved with young adolescent boys, but it was considered some kind of a very normal thing and a rite of passage even for boys, as far as I remember reading. And it's interesting because you find similar impulses in other cultures as well, in other places as well. I was very intrigued when in Kerala there's the Kodungalur temple where back in the day during the festival, people used to hurl abuses at the goddess. I mean, they used to sing the most sort of graphic, extremely sort of direct songs about the goddess, her body, and things like that. And I was very stunned to meet the grandson of a very famous early 20th century poet in Kerala, who told me about similar songs and similar, proverbs and catchphrases that existed about the gay community. And he said that they were never nasty. There was a kind of hint, hint, wink, wink kind of a tone to them, but they were never really nasty. They were never really, oh, this is somehow wrong. That kind of a thing wasn't included in those stories. It was considered, let's say, not the norm. It was considered something different. Yet there was a kind of space to accept it quietly and sort of, even hint, hint, wink, wink at it. So I wouldn't say it was complete acceptance and some kind of a wonderful universe where all kinds of sexualities flourished, but all the same, there wasn't that kind of, pointed hatred towards a segment of people. So I think there is a lot to unearth there. I think I also often make the point that just as feminist research has changed our perspectives on subjects, in the coming decades, the LGBTQ perspective will also cause revisions to be made in a lot of received wisdom, in a lot of material that we've already consumed. We know of, speaking of the Deccan Sultans, for example, one of them, Ali Adil Shah, was murdered by, if I'm not mistaken, by one of the I mean, in quotes, a eunuch. It's not a word we would use today, but one of his eunuchs, because he had a kind of interest for the eunuch. So, there are characters like that. There are historical figures like that. There are, one shouldn't talk about contemporary politics, but there are whispers in contemporary politics also. So it's there around us. It's just that the more acceptable it becomes to talk about it, I'm sure we'll read more about it as well. And I think there are people working on it. Madhavi would be a great person to give names.
She did the AMA with us, and she
did.
Yeah, and she challenged the idea of having these strict categories, that is lesbian and gay and bisexual and all of that. She said,
I agree. Because frankly, this reminds me, years ago in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, I went to the Madurai Meenakshi temple. And I still remember vividly a pillar over there, which was Arjuna becoming Arjuni. And, this is Arjuna of the Mahabharata becoming Arjuni. And that, in fact, that entire temple is full of the most fascinating sculptures, much of which also has, the goddess herself in her legend has this androgynous quality. And this particular, pillar where Arjuni or the transition is depicted, you have the face of a man. And to me, it looked like a man with Southeast Asian features with a long pointed beard, but the body of a woman. And again, not to get too French in describing these things, but you have the woman's breasts, but again, the nipples of a man. It was the most fascinating temple pillar I had seen. And it was just one pillar over there. There were a lot of other pillars over there as well. And it's a temple. It's there. It's right there in front of our eyes. And again, nobody's really talking about it. And I think you're right. Madhavi is correct when she says that a lot of these categories we today apply, historically speaking, don't necessarily make sense. I think people were more comfortable with fluidity then. People were more comfortable often bending some of these categories or whatever categories existed then as well, which is why watertight categories as we imagine them in a world where everything is organized and sort of put into its own boxes may not be the best way to necessarily catalog the past on its own terms.
Great. So Anupama, you have a whole bunch of questions, but I'm afraid you have to pick one because there are lots of people behind you waiting for their turn. Anupama?
Hello?
Yes,
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Manu. How are you?
All well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm a great fan of you. A pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
And yeah, my question is, I think you spent almost 5 or 6 years on Ivory Throne, right?
Yeah.
How did you manage or balance your both work life or your personal life and your writer life?
I wish I had balanced it better, but the frank truth is that it was quite tough. At the time, I didn't think of it as tough. It was something that was motivating me so much that it was just something you had to do. I didn't really cry about it or feel that, oh my God, it's so tough. But now in hindsight, when I look at the 19-year-old kid who went into it, I'm now 31, which means a decade has passed since I got into the project. I do feel that, I was pretty harsh on myself. I was quite sort of, determined, which meant that, when I was at university, it was fine because I was doing my master's in London and I would do my classes and quickly hop off to the archives, didn't hang out with any of my classmates. I wasn't very tuned into what was happening in the university. I only went to the extent it was absolutely necessary. And the rest of the time I was in the archives. In a sense, it was a fairly isolating process because, you're stuck 12 hours a day, 10 hours a day at a desk, working in a very silent room with lots of other silent people on your material. In a sense, it was also a great experience because it really teaches you a lot about yourself. This is another line I've increasingly started using, which is that although I wrote The Ivory Throne, the book also changed me. The book also ended up transforming me as a person because the 6 years,
definitely.
the person who went in was not the person who emerged at the other end. So no regrets in that sense, but I think there was a lot of stress. There were frustrating phases. There was a lot of stress eating. I had a phase when I could down an entire tub of ice cream in a single sitting, which was obviously stress eating. At that time, I didn't have the words for it, but that's obviously what it was. And so there were ups and downs. Time management was something I learned in the process. And especially after I started working with a parliamentarian, then it was pretty stressful because what would happen is I'd be at my job, say by 8:39 in the morning, and during parliament sessions, we would end late at night, 9, 10, etc. And then I would have to sit and work till about 2, 3 in the morning on my book, on my writing. And it wasn't always pleasant. It was extremely tiring. And, you really had to really motivate yourself. But again, now that I think of it, no regrets. I think putting myself through a punishing, grueling schedule early in life actually has paid dividends, which it's been a good experience in terms of, I don't know, sculpting whatever one would call character and personality and all that.
Thank you, Manu. Thank you so much.
Actually, so Manu worked with Shashi Tharoor, actually.
Yes.
That's how I first met Manu, if I remember correctly.
Oh, yeah, maybe. Oh, yeah. When you were at First Post, no?
Yes, I was running First Post at the time.
Yes, I remember.
Okay, so Divya has a question. I had no idea that you were an economics graduate. Divya? Divya, do you want to ask your question? Has Divya disappeared? Okay, let me ask Divya's question for her. She says, you're an economics graduate. What new motivated you to write a book with a historical perspective?
No, I was always interested in history. It's just that I had no desire to study history at university level because at the time I was at university, I wasn't terribly impressed with the course. I wasn't terribly impressed with the teachers that were teaching those courses. So, I decided, let me just do economics and pursue history privately on the side. Which is why I'm trying to now correct it by doing my PhD thesis on history, because that's, to get some kind of formal grounding in the field. But otherwise, yes, I did study economics and international relations, but also because for the longest time, I did want to get into foreign policy. To be fair, though, even in economics, the subject I loved the most, we had this one subject called History of Economic Thought. That was my favorite subject, and I think my best scoring subject, because again, it combined history with economics.
Great. So, Joel, I think Manu's already answered this question about how he filters out information. So, Nivedita also asked about your Insta handle.
That is a story, and I keep getting a lot of questions about it. The thing is, my Insta handle is What Coconut. It's really just a phrase my father used to use because, whenever somebody speaks some rubbish, we say, what nonsense are you talking? But my father, with his thick Malayali accent, used to say, what coconut are you talking? And I loved the phrase, and I could never use it with the same punch and force that he did. But years ago, before my Instagram became some kind of a public Instagram with lots of followers, it was just a private Instagram account, and it's always been What Coconut. And just because now people have read my books and, I have a larger number of followers, I see no reason to change it. It's a kind of distinct handle, and I'd like to stick to it. It simply means, it's a form of saying what nonsense is happening.
Okay. So, Saheli, you want to ask a question? She has the question about Orientalist influences on history. Saheli?
Yeah, hi. Hello, Manu.
Hi, Saheli. Again, if you're the same Saheli from Bangalore.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I am that Saheli.
Again. Yes.
Yeah. So my question here is like, how do you as a historian, basically, I also come from a comparative literature background. So even I have such difficulties. So how do you have, as a historian, overcome the Orientalist periodization into Hindu, Muslim, and British era? Because that has been like embedded in our consciousness, and it still prevails like even till today. Like, how do you overcome that? Because it's not as flat as it like sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, luckily for my generation of students of history, that Orientalist classification of history, which is that there was some glorious ancient period, then which was a Hindu period, then there was a Muslim period, and then the British sort of recovered India's glory and sort of delivered modernity to us. That whole narrative has already been debunked quite comprehensively. If it survives chiefly in the political space. That is, political readings of history for political narratives, political purposes. They still like to believe it. So, I mean, one set of parties will say that they still believe in it in the sense that they think there was an ancient glorious period, but the Islamic period was also wonderful, and it was the British period alone that was the terrible period. The other says no, the British and the Islamic period were terrible, and only the ancient was worth respecting. But in reality, these periodizations themselves don't make sense. Now the way we classify things is there's ancient, earlier it was just medieval, now there's early medieval, late medieval, early modern, late modern, etc., and then contemporary, and so on. So there's already those classifications have changed because that Orientalist reading of history, in fact, it really boils down to a couple of people, like including James Mill, famously in the 19th century, who came up with this formula and popularized it. that really has been debunked quite comprehensively. So those of us who work seriously on history are already well away and well out of that trap. I don't think anyone buys into that trap anymore. Anybody serious, at least.
Great. So Bhavna and actually Kshitija have similar questions. Bhavna, you want to ask it, and I can just add Kshitija's bit to it.
Yeah, sure. So hi, Manu. Like I've heard you mention in your previous interviews, you had access to a lot of exclusive research at such a young age. So my curiosity is that, like, did you ever feel like it was such a big responsibility, which you had in your hands, that you had to tell this tale in the right way? And, like, did you ever feel that you were young or, that kind of a feeling? Because I am currently starting to write about something, and I sometimes feel like, maybe I'm not old enough to write about this. So what would your advice be to such a person?
I think the one thing to do is read as much as possible on the existing scholarly material that's there on the subject or on connected themes, because that really means that you're at least not copying out and taking some kind of a shortcut. You're engaging with the material that's there and trying your best. So simply engaging with the best scholarly material, the most recent scholarly material, helps you cover your bases and make sure that you're not sort of regurgitating something that was already debunked 10 years ago. That's one way of doing it. The other thing is to also give yourself time. I remember that I briefly came close in 2012 to publishing The Ivory Throne, and I'm glad I didn't, with good reason, because actually, now that I think of it, I wasn't ready at that time. The next 3 years, which is the rest of the time that it took to actually finish the book, they were critical, and they made a huge difference to the book itself. So I think it's important to give yourself time. It's important not to be in a hurry to publish, and especially a first book, because frankly, a first book, if it's a terrible book, it never goes away. It haunts you for the rest of your life. So it's better to just give yourself time and space, be as thorough as you can. But I don't think age by itself is a disqualification. If you've done your research, if you've gone into the depth of the subject, if you've covered all your bases, if you've made the effort, and then you're objectively certain that, okay, fine, I've got a point to make, I can make it reasonably well, and I think I've covered everything that needs to be covered, then I think by all means, you can go ahead and publish. It's just that, some people get into this craze of, oh, I want to write a book before I'm this particular age, for example, almost as if it's some kind of a status symbol. That is often what leads to all kinds of issues, because you're not giving yourself the time to be with the material and to really let it sink in and understand it with all its gravity, with all its depth, with all its seriousness and importance.
And that is beginning and sort of, okay, I'm going to connect that to the fact that, like, before historians were like kind of fusty people who are on the seminar circuits. And now, you have historians who are celebrities, they're almost brands in themselves. They have social media presence, and that pressure to kind of achieve and be that young, hotshot historian, who is going to be on every circuit and glossies and all of that. First of all, I feel like you're a very ideal candidate for that. At some level, your trajectory has really, follow that. Like at some level, you hit the sweet spot. Come on, you achieved at a very young age. You're young, you're good looking, you're very articulate, you're very marketable, right? But I also want you to think about, like, therefore the temptation to market yourself, which is, I'm saying that because it is an option to market yourself and to package yourself in that way. And there is a huge pressure now, even within the publishing industry, to package yourself in that way. So how do you deal with that?
I think this whole business of packaging, that's a general trend. Every field, everywhere, you're expected to sort of put yourself out there and be this sort of this personality or whatever. The one way in which I try and sort of stay a little distant from that is that even if you go on my Instagram, it's not a very serious Instagram. I post the most foolish things. Just now, before I came on your AMA, I just posted something with me with one of those mustache filters, saying that, oh, look, I'm a creepy uncle. Because frankly, you need to not take yourself so seriously. And I try very hard not to take myself all that seriously. My work is serious, but that doesn't mean I am some kind of ultra serious, extremely sort of self-obsessed, self-involved person. I think one thing that I've learned from history is that ultimately we are all small fish in a very, very, very large pond. And having that basic humility helps in life. That's one useful thing to know. The other thing is, I mean, there are certain pressures, but there are ways to navigate it. It may be easy for me to say, because the frank truth is my first book was a success, which meant that I didn't have troubles in the publishing industry. I didn't have troubles with contracts and, you know, all of that, which perhaps gives me some kind of a slightly different perspective. It's not been the case that I wrote a lot of, let's say, articles, etc., and then eventually wrote a book. For me, it was actually 6 years book, and then every other kind of writing that I've done, which meant that I was always, relatively speaking, in something of a position of strength, because the very first book was a 700-page, and yet it became pager, and yet became a bestseller, and now it's being developed for a web series, So all of that means that you're in a position of strength. So the market doesn't necessarily push you in the way somebody else might get pushed. I'm able to sort of hold my own and say, look, these are the things I will work on. These are the things I will do. For example, again, it feels like I'm actually blowing my own trumpet too much here, but since you asked, the point is, somebody, you know, people say, why don't you do a podcast, for example? Why don't you do some other kind of format, etc.? But the thing is, just because you may be good at it, just because people may think you're able to handle another format, the question is, do I want to go putting my finger in every pie that's on offer? Or do I want to stick just to writing, just to my research, just to history for now, focus and really be able to fill a whole shelf, rather than distracting myself and frittering away my energy just because something looks sexy or something is in at any given moment? For me, the answer is very clear. I don't, because I think I'd like to be here for the long run, which is to say that I really want to focus on books. I really, at the end, I mean, I was 25 when the first book was published. Now at 31, already I've got grays on my chin, which means that, you know, this whole young historian thing is clearly fading away very quickly. So all that considered, and the one thing that history teaches you, as I said earlier, is that everything is transient. There's no guarantee that you're going to be some kind of cool figure for a very long time. For all you know, tomorrow another 25-year-old kid will write a very successful book, and I'll be some kind of forgotten old person. So that being said, I really want to aim that in 25 years from now, if I'm looking back at what I've done, what I want to be able to see is at least one shelf of books. There may be some pebbles, but I also want most of them to be gems. So there are gems and pebbles both, because everybody's career has gems and pebbles. But even so, I want one set of good books that can fill at least one shelf. Which is not to say I may not do podcasts, I may not do something else. It's just that my priority is not those things. My priority is to focus very much on what I know I can do, what I know I can pull off decently, and just stick to that.
Great answer. You know, because in the end, a book lasts forever, right? Even
yeah, I mean,
after you're dead.
That's why fascists hate books, right? Because they last for a very long time.
Yes, and no one's going to listen to a podcast that's 10 years old, trust me.
Yeah.
Dishya actually has a question about your writing. Dishya?
Hello, Manu.
Hi.
Yeah, so my question is that having interest in something is different, is one thing, and being able to articulate about that perspective of something that interests you is another thing. So how did you discover that you can be articulative regarding your perspectives? And who discovered the writer in you? Or maybe you're on your own, or?
Articulate in what sense? In terms of speaking about it or writing about it?
Writing about it. Maybe you can.
I mean, if I had to go back in time, it was my father who thought for the first time that I wrote well. When I was somewhere around 10 or 12 years old, he said that, oh, you actually write well. And when somebody says that to you, that's when you even sit up and think, oh, really, writing is a thing. Maybe, if you write well, then maybe I should do more of that. So I did, I've said this maybe in a couple of sessions before, but one of the first things I wrote was a completely plagiarized fantasy fiction novel, in quotes. I was 13 or 14 years old, so you can imagine it was a complete disaster about wizards and witches and that kind of thing. It was not plagiarized from Harry Potter, but it was from some other book about witches and wizards. And I completely just copied the plot, but wrote my own dialogues and changed all of that. Luckily, only my father and sister read it, and they did not praise me too much for it. So that was good to know. But I think because once you realize that, okay, I'm pretty decent at this. In school, for example, I used to write the class skits. We had these weekly little dramatic performances we had to do, and I used to enjoy writing those. I used to enjoy doing a little bit of comedy. I briefly dabbled in acting, which is quite funny. But there was a sense that this sort of what people bracket as creative stuff is my stuff. There was a certain interest there. Then as time passed, as I got older, closer to graduation, etc., I had already by then cultivated an interest in history, which meant that I also knew I wanted to focus on that, which meant that for me, the best thing was try and marry the two, writing with history. So I enjoy research. I enjoy spending hours and hours with old papers, with old people even, listening to their stories. I enjoy reading about the past. I enjoy trying to understand the past and historical figures. Why not combine that with the other thing I enjoy, which is to write?
So how did you shape your voice regarding that when you knew that you have to work on, how you write and bring across your points? So what was your next step?
I think with everything, as with everything else, practice makes perfect. The more you do something, the more you know it, the more you know yourself and what you want to achieve through that medium. And it was simply practice. It was simply, and it wasn't like my writing voice was clear from the start. If I go back even to the early drafts of The Ivory Throne, they're a completely different type of writing. And I'm not very proud of it. I would never want anybody to read those early drafts of The Ivory Throne, because that's not eventually what got published. Because by the time it got published, 6 years into the process, I had evolved, my voice had evolved, how I wanted to write, all of those things had evolved. As I said earlier, a lot of people, they write for newspapers, they write for publications, often they're journalists, etc., or they do their PhD thesis first, and then that becomes a book. The book comes at a much later stage. For me, multiple drafts of the same book were my homework. They were the means by which I constantly tried to keep improving, keep changing, slightly conscious also that I'm writing about a relatively obscure subject. I want people to read it, which means the writing has to be of a type that also attracts readers. So being not overly conscious of it to the extent that you're going out of your way to flatter the reader, but all the same making sure that your writing is interesting and fun to read. And working through multiple drafts, I think, helped me get to that point where I knew, okay, now maybe I can publish. Which said, even now, now that all these 6 years have passed since the book came out, there's a lot I would change in The Ivory Throne. I wouldn't make it such a long book. I would slice off 150 pages and make it a shorter narrative. Certain things which I thought I was being very smart about, I would not do. For example, the book begins using very archaic 19th century English. And I thought that, I would upgrade the language as time passes. So by the time the book ends, the language is much more contemporary, because that was almost by design. I thought I was being very clever, but I wouldn't do tricks like that in any new book that I do, because I think it's better to just be direct and stick to a simple method rather than trying these complicated tricks that not all readers may understand.
Are you the kind of writer who goes back and sort of re-edits yourself every time you write anything, whether it's a column?
No, I haven't read The Ivory Throne since. I haven't read any of my previous books since. I mean, the only time I may go and re-edit is if somebody points out some kind of an error. And these are,
I mean, books. Mentally, where you're like, oh my God. Are you the kind of person who goes back and says, wow, I wrote that, that's fantastic? Or are you the kind of person who goes back and says, oh shit, I should have starts editing it. Like sometimes that happens to me, I've written cover stories that I think are so amazing. And then I read them now and I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, I think I'm more like you, which is that, frankly, no matter what the world says, you go back and read something you wrote a few years ago. For me, it's really a feeling of a mini cringe, really, because you're also evolving with time, right? So your writing style is also changing over the years. Everything else is changing over the years. So, for example, I'd be like, why is this sentence so long? Why didn't I shorten it? Why didn't I break it up into 2 sentences? So those kind of questions keep emerging in my mind. The other people may still, I know sections of The Ivory Throne, for example, are being taught, I think, in part of some college syllabus in Kerala and so on, part of their English literature course. And I find it a bit amusing because I actually don't like that section anymore. I absolutely can't stand that section of the book anymore. And when the only reason I read it again is when I heard it was being used for the textbook. And I said, why this? Why this? You should have picked up something or asked me. I would have given you a better section.
Okay, a couple of questions about your research process. I think people just see they're very different questions you get from our audience. So Aishwarya, you want to talk about it? Because I think I can see at least a couple of other questions about the research process. Is she there? No. Okay, so basically people want to know how you research. Do you take notes? Do you reread it? There's a question about how you use technology in your research. There is a sort of, do you paraphrase or do you make a note of it? I think people just want to know the nitty gritty. Like, what are you doing when you're sitting in that archive for hours and not hanging out with anybody and having a life?
You know, back in the day, I would take notes on my laptop. I mean, the one advantage many of these archives have, I mean, some places they don't let you take laptops, so you have to make notes by hand. But most places you can take your laptop at least. And I immediately just type up my stuff into a Word document. And then each Word document has the catalog reference and the source of the material. And that's how I put it down. This last stint, I was just in London at the British Archives in London in October for about four weeks, because I had to get a chunk of material out from the old India office records over there. And this time I just decided for the first time in my life to scan all the documents, because now they allow you to do that. And I decided this is easier. I can cover more ground in one short trip. I can cover a lot of ground because I'm not physically sitting and typing it up. I can just scan the page. I am reading it. I do read it thoroughly, but all the same, I can take pictures of each page and have digital copies of those archival files in my laptop and then go revisit them as and when needed. Earlier, it used to be, live as I was reading, I would type it up into my laptop, and it was quite it really improved my typing speeds. I could type without even looking at my screen. It gave me some useful skills like that. Some places, of course, you also record interviews with people. So when you go to meet people with the Ivory Throne, for example, the protagonist only died in the 1980s. So there were a lot of people who knew the protagonist as well as the, in quotes, antagonist of the book. So going and meeting these people, interviewing them, I had to learn how to conduct interviews. For example, there's always somebody says something interesting and you quickly want to ask them a follow-up question, right? And I quickly realized that actually that's the wrong way, because before they can finish a point, you've, in your enthusiasm, jumped to the next question or jumped to something else. Whereas you actually allow them to finish, you give them a lot of time to finish. And even if there are awkward silences, let the silence be there, because frankly, then they start thinking again and they come up with something new and they come up with something more. So that I've learned that as the interviewer, it's useful not to speak too much, to actually let the other person do much of the talking, because you end up getting a lot more information from the person you're interviewing simply by giving them the room, by giving them that space. So, little things like that. It also includes reading up a lot of things that are not directly connected to your work, but also important to know. So with my newest book, because the history of these 5 princely states is woven through the painting career of Raja Ravi Varma, it involved reading up about him, about art history, about how to interpret paintings, how other scholars have worked. So even if I'm looking at a Ravi Varma painting, I will go and read a book on Mughal painting, because just to see how scholars have analyzed those paintings, how they've analyzed those miniature paintings, and whether anything I learn there can be applied to my subject, which is Ravi Varma's paintings. And it's very useful. So, it's a bunch of things like this.
But I'm surprised the technology hasn't moved. I mean, okay, I'm old enough to remember note cards, which you had to do research in the old days. But still, it seems to me like, okay, docs, like, even finding, when you actually accumulate so much material, even if you categorize them, to find exactly in that doc, what is that one quote that you remember? And you're talking about now audio, that means transcription. So then it's a very long transcript. I mean, just finding what is most relevant when you're just collecting, when you're in the collection part of your process, right? And then to go back and to find what it is that you're looking for, or isn't there a better way to do this than docs? And I'm a little shocked that it's
to be fair, I think there is. I think other people do use better softwares, etc. I just happen to be slightly old-fashioned. So within this new generation or whatever, I'm a little bit of a fossil. I still work with Word documents. I still work in a style that has become familiar to me, and therefore it's comfortable for me. It is messy because I know that by the time I finish a book, it really is a headache, because it's messy to try and get everything together, etc. Because it's spread over all these Word documents, etc. But that's just how I work. I suppose there's something about enjoying that kind of mess. God knows. But I do know other people. Some of my PhD colleagues, for example, their footnoting softwares, the softwares they use, are much more up to date. They're not as old-fashioned as me.
Okay, my partner now still writes in moleskin notebooks. I don't know how he finds anything. Like, 50 of them sitting in the cupboard, and I have no idea how he finds anything. So, Divya, you get the last question. She wants,
Yeah, sure. Hi, Manu.
Hi.
Yeah, my question to you is that how do you make such voluminous data available to a rather a historical audience in such a palatable manner? Like, what is your secret, as to say?
I mean, I don't think there's a secret as such. It's just, I think, an equal amount of emphasis on the writing itself, which is to say that the way most scholars, for example, work is the focus is very much on the research and then using, for example, academic jargon, using terms that only people in the seminar circuit understand. Whereas for me, it is a lot of emphasis on the research, but an equal measure of emphasis on the writing as well. Because I think it's important that what I have found should be easy for people to understand. I sometimes feel that it's a bit counterproductive to drown yourself in jargon, because the frank truth is, who's understanding what you're writing? There's so much interesting work that's done. And the real tragedy is that most people don't know about it simply because all that interesting research is stuck in bad writing. It's just stuck in this extremely rigid, extremely academic style of writing. So for me, it's a simple thing. I invest in the writing. I invest in making it interesting for whoever's reading the book. It could be a variety of people. And I test this out in ways. When my last book came out, I had a series of people to read it. There were 4 senior scholars who work on the princely estates who read it and gave me feedback. That was for the research, the integrity, and the importance of the argument, that kind of thing. Then I had a young student who's also at my university, a very talented young man called Ranvijay Singh Hada, who's a kind of military historian in the making. I asked him to, and completely, quite randomly, he called me for something else on Vijayanagara. And I said, hey, why don't you read this manuscript and tell me what you think? Because you're a 20-year-old person, and let me know if it makes sense to you. I also got a person in Bangalore, as it happens, who had taken one of my courses that I taught online for Ashoka University called Smita. She is a person who's worked in the corporate field, etc. And I got her to read it as well, because I wanted to see if the same text, if the same book would also appeal to somebody of her background, of her position. So you get different kinds of people to give you feedback, and you realize whether or not your writing is actually, whether it appeals to a large enough set of readers. So, I have little techniques like this, which gives me a sense of, okay, it seems to be working. Maybe I can go ahead and publish it.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have one, actually, I forgot. It's a huge fan of yours, Ginza George, who unfortunately can't be here. And he has a question because he wants to really gift false allies as a wedding gift. And he's a little upset that Amazon doesn't sell like signed copies at a higher price.
No, sadly, yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose there's no help for him. He wants to know why you don't do that. He just really wanted to.
No, the thing is, signed copies are always made available in physical bookstores. And in fact, that's, Amazon sort of come in and really does affect sales in bookstores. So we try to help out bookstores by, making sure that they have the special signed copies, as it were. So usually when I travel, my publishers arrange signings in all these stores, and I go and sign a whole bunch of copies in physical bookstores. I don't sign copies that are then sold online. That's just not a thing. So all the bookstores, however, every time I go, I end up signing it, unless it's not scheduled. Like I don't walk into a random bookstore and say, hey, I am so and so, and these are my books, let me sign it. That doesn't happen. But if my publisher set it up, I do end up signing, but only in bookstores. So the best way to get a signed copy is to find a local bookstore. And if I've been in the city anytime in the recent past, chances are they might have signed copies.
Okay, good. I'll pass that on. Thank you so much, Manu, for doing this. I hope it's every bit as pleasant as we promised you.
Very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a lovely, lovely, lovely audience who thank you so much for all your questions. You're the guys who make these things special and make the whole Splainer experience different and unique for our guests. So we're always very grateful to you.
And everybody go and subscribe to Splainer at once if you haven't already.
Thank you, Manu. We really need the subscriptions, man. Yes, and we are every bit as enjoyable in terms of getting your daily news every day. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Guys.
Bye. Bye.